Call the roll, please.
Thank you. Chairwoman Johnson, Vice Chairman Bisson,
Present.
Member Bettenhurst, Member Connor,
Present.
Member Jackoni,
Present.
Member Naderas, Member Scholl. Executive Director Robert Raposa, Legal Counsel Raymond Parsha.
Present.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
The first order of business is the board will vote to certify voting equipment to be used for the Woonsocket City Council primary to be held on Tuesday, February 6, 2024. And I won't call you a pinch hitter for the director, but I will ask you to address item 1. Green light should be good.
Good afternoon, members of the board. On January 11th, 2024, at 11 a.m., the staff conducted public logic and accuracy testing for the Woonsocket City Council special primary. The number of machines that were tested, as you can see there on the screen, for the purpose of conducting the early voting and the polling places. On election day, we tested for early voting 2 DS200s, one of which is to serve as a spare for the local boards of canvassers, as well as 2 express votes. The election day, for 6 precincts, we tested 12 DS200s and 6 express votes for operation at the polling place. For backup purposes, we tested 2 DS200 voting units and 2 express vote voting units as well. Those will be used as backups for both the precinct and the DS 850s, which are used to tabulate the mail ballots. And for mail ballots, we tested the DS 850. The test deck involved inserting 36 ballots into each DS 200 to be tested, which were tested on January 11th. That same test deck was also run through the DS 850 3 times because of the small quantity of ballots. 36 ballots, our DS 850 can test very quickly. We decided to run those through 3 times through that DS 850. And the results are presented before you today, where you should have 3 reports as well as a key to indicate the pre-testing 0 report, the election day results, and then the post-testing zeroing out of the machines to ensure that when the poll workers turn these on election day morning, they will in fact be at 0. And you also have the expected results from the key before you, and everything did match up. We did not have any DS200s which failed the testing or had to be replaced, and we had no express votes that failed and needed to be replaced. With that being said, I hereby request that the board certify the voting equipment to be used in the Woonsocket special primary on February 6th.
Is there a second? Moved and seconded. I'll call for a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Ayes have it. All opposed? Ayes have it. Item number 2, the board may discuss and vote to support legislation to be presented to the General Assembly by the staff of the Board of Elections as set forth in the legislative summary. And I think Miguel will answer that as well.
Members of the board, before you today, we have two pieces of legislation which are recommended by the staff to be submitted for this legislative session of the General Assembly upcoming. Both of these pieces of legislation were introduced by the board in the previous session. So they are repeats. They did not pass during the last session, and we are requesting that the board authorize the staff to transmit the legislation to the General Assembly for submittal as well this year. The first piece of legislation is the signing with an X and the 3-day transmittal period. This piece of legislation would eliminate the requirement of signing with an X for voters who cannot sign their name due to physical incapacity. It would affect applications for mail ballots as well as mail ballot return envelopes. The individual assisting the voter to complete the application or the ballot envelope would need to include their name, residence address, signature, and optionally their telephone number and their email address. It would also allow applications for mail ballots to be accepted by the local boards if delivered by the Postal Service within 3 days after the application deadline. The reason for the staff requesting that this legislation be introduced is because currently state law allows anyone who is unable to sign their name due to physical capacity, either on the mail ballot application or on the actual envelope, which we certify when the ballot comes back to us to tabulate. The law allows them to mark an X, and by law, we do have to accept that, any X that is marked there. This would put in a more of a safeguard for us to capture any information for an individual who is assisting that voter in completing that application or that certification return envelope, because if in the event that there is any sort of irregularities, we would at least have a method of investigating and potentially contacting or referring to the state police or the Attorney General's office any information that we gather from those certification envelopes or from those mail ballot applications. And this is actually modeled in a similar way to how Massachusetts handles their mail ballot applications and how assistance is rendered in the cases where the voter cannot actually sign their name. The final point there is the 3-day transmittal period. We've heard from local boards consistently that in the rush to get applications in at the last moment before the deadline, sometimes and many times applications do arrive at their office late, particularly how the Postal Service actually has their delivery schedule, and with the deadline typically falling on a Tuesday, for example, many applications get to the local boards too late. And so what happens is the local board has to disqualify or reject each of those applications. And at the same time, they generally send them a letter with an application for an emergency mail ballot, which looks almost identical to an application for a regular mail ballot. The only difference being that it says emergency mail ballot application at the top. And as you know, when the law changed several years ago to not require any excuse, and then after the pandemic with the Let Rhode Island Vote Act, which essentially made voting a choice, voting by mail a choice by voters, the distinction between the emergency and the mail ballot application is very little at this point. So this would allow those local boards to continue to process those applications if they are delivered within that 3-day period after the deadline. So that would avoid them having to reject those applications, generate a letter, and send them out, and the voter would still be able to receive their mail ballot as they expect to if their application is in fact approved by the local board. I'm happy to answer any questions on this piece of legislation.
Commissioner Jekyll?
Miguel, just a question on Part C, the 3 days. What is in reference to those 21 days before the election, what is the emergency mail ballot period? Because clearly there's some overlap.
That would be within the, when the application is received not later than the 21st day. So that is the mail ballot application
That's the
deadline.
mail ballot. What is the last day of emergency mail ballot?
It lines up with early voting, 4 o'clock the day before Election Day, generally.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Connors?
Just a question. If you could briefly explain to me the process for certifying mail ballots?
So the process begins when the voter submits their application. So that can either be through the online mail ballot application tool that's provided by the Secretary of State, as long as the voter has their driver's license or their voter identification issued by the DMV. They're able to apply for a mail ballot online, or they can fill out a paper application. Either way, that application is transmitted to the local boards, either by the voter dropping off, mailing it, or submitting it electronically through the CVRS through the online portal. The board of canvassers will then compare the signature on that application to the voters' most recent signatures on in the central voter registration system. If they feel that signature matches, then they are authorized to certify that application to the Secretary of State's office, and the Secretary of State's office will then mail a ballot to that voter. Once the voter mails that ballot back to us, or they can drop it into one of our drop boxes, 41 drop boxes that are located throughout the state. We will receive it, we will scan it in, we take an image of the front of that envelope, and we timestamp it and date stamp it. And our pairs of election officials here, our teams will compare the signature that they place on that certification envelope where the ballot is contained inside of, and we'll compare it to the voter's most recent signatures in the CVRS as well. If that does match, then the ballot is cleared to be tabulated. If it does not match, we also have 2 additional teams review it to see if they confirm and do some additional review of that signature. And if everyone on those teams confirms it does not match, then the voter is then sent a letter of deficiency, and they have generally 3 to 7 days, depending on the type of election, to return that ballot, that deficiency form to the Board of Elections, so that we can in fact count their ballot. But unless they do so, then the ballot will not be counted and it's voided.
And then in a case where a voter's as of now marking an X, how does that process change at all?
So it would change if the local board does not have that information on that application, then they would reject it. So if there is no signature and there is no assistant information on there, then it would be rejected until it's corrected. For our part, and the deficiency notice, we would generate a deficiency notice to send that to that individual to gather that assistance information. If they were assisted and they weren't able to sign their name, then they would have the opportunity to correct that within the 3 to 7 days.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Actually, sorry. I noticed on the, in section H and, sorry, C and H, it just references upon order of the state board or when directed by the state board. What is the purpose of those additions?
Are you?
On page 3 and 4.
Yeah. Under 1720-10.
So this is a relic. This is to address a relic of how elections were processed many years ago. In the past, the local boards used to actually transmit or deliver to us the actual applications, and then we would have to sort those, match them up to the ballot, and that's how we would do signature confirmation. And actually, the board members would actually do that in the past. That was changed over the years to have the staff do the signature verification. And then during the pandemic, the law was changed to allow the signature that is matched to be the one that's in the CVRS, the Central Voter Registration System. So we compare the signature on the ballot envelope to the Central Voter Registration System now. Years ago, we used to compare the signature on the ballot envelope to the actual application. And in order to do that, we would need the physical application. So at this point, there is no need for the local boards to transmit to us the physical applications unless, of course, the board orders them to because of this part of some investigation.
Okay. Thank you.
Well,
And just for council, Ray, you've had an opportunity to look at the changes,
I have.
and it's exactly what we submitted to the legislature last year.
This is, I can't think of any other changes to it. I think, as you know, 1 or 2 years ago, we removed the requirement for a notary or 2 witnesses or a witness. And we did not, at that point, address the use of the X. So you have this area of application process and the use of the X where there's really no protection in place. This would afford us some protection because we would now have someone assisting the person who is disabled to attest as well or to state that the person has a condition that precludes the use of the signature. That affords us some protection, at least, similar to what we had with the use of the notary, the 2 witnesses, and all of which is now gone.
So in the past, we would have been able to contact a notary or a witness to determine if there was a question, whether or not the voter made that X.
Correct.
Since that's been removed, this will sort of give us some indicator of
Yes,
who signed the document or whose presence the document was signed.
right, this area was kind of floating in need of some additional protection because of the elimination of those requirements. We did not think, and now when I say we, I did not think at least a year ago or more, that it would be appropriate to add in the notary provision or the 2 witnesses, because you would then be burdening people with a disability in a way that is more so than people who are otherwise submitting an application. So this was an attempt to make sure that there is some protection, as well as giving people who have a disability the opportunity to apply.
If there are no other questions, is there a motion to either vote to support or not support the legislation?
So, Mr. Chair, we worked on this last year. This is something that
Mhm.
it's an important piece of legislation, so I vote that we support this legislation.
Is there a second?
Sorry.
Commissioner Connors, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? The ayes have it. Item number 3, the board may discuss and vote to support legislation to be presented to the General Assembly by the Rhode Island Towns and Cities Clerk Associations as set forth in the attached legislative summary.
Excuse me. Before we get there, this was support legislation dealing with 17-20-2.1.
22.1, I think, right? 20, oh, okay.
Yeah, 20-2.1. But a mail drop, there's another piece of legislation here.
Mhm.
Is that going to be, are we going to discuss that separately?
the mail ballot
Yes.
drop boxes?
Yes.
Yes.
So let's go back to that. That's point well taken, Commissioner. We'll go back to item 2 with regard to section 1720-22.1, which is mail drop boxes. That's another piece of legislation that was provided by the staff that was included in item 2 in our package.
So this piece of legislation was also introduced last year for board members who are new to the board since last year. If you're unaware, in 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the state for the first time instituted the use of drop boxes. And we have 41 drop boxes statewide located at the local boards of canvassers in most cases. We have one out here in our parking lot, and we also have one located at the Secretary of State's office. And the board at the time implemented regulations to authorize the use of the drop boxes, but that was codified into state law in 2022 with the Let Rhode Island Vote Act. And this act is what instituted this section of state law, which you have before you. that we're seeking to modify. Last year, the board introduced legislation to change that timeframe from when drop boxes should be available from the current 20 days to 35 days. Originally, the staff had proposed it be changed to 30 days, but then at the request of the Secretary of State's office, we changed that to 35 days, which the staff was in agreement with at the time. The issue with the legislation last year is that it was determined that it would conflict with special elections in some cases, because as you know, special elections in many cases are usually held within 30 days of each other. You may have a primary for example, like in Woonsocket in February, but then you would have a special election, the actual general election, in March. So that 35-day window basically made it so that you essentially couldn't lock the box at the election night for the primary if you had the special election the following month. So you literally could not lock the box on the night of the primary because you had to leave it open under state law to be available for ballots for the actual general election, which the ballot was being set for in that very primary. So we addressed that in this legislation that we sent out to you, by changing the timeline for special elections to 20 days. So that addresses the special elections, which are back-to-back months, primary in 1 month, and then the special general election in the second month. However, the issue remains on how to handle special elections that are conducted the month prior to a statewide election, which will fall within 35 days. For example, this August 2024. You see here on the screen, the primary is being held on September 10th. And the special election, if there were to be a special election held in a community on August 6th, that's 35 days prior to the primary. So this statute would require us to open the drop boxes for the primary on August 6th. However, the same statute would require that we lock the drop box for the special election being held in that particular community. So we have one statute saying in the morning you need to open the drop box, part of the statute saying you need to open the drop box for the statewide primary, but then another part telling us that you need to lock it at 8 o'clock for that special election day that's happening in that month. So we do have a conflict here that needs to be addressed, which could occur in situations similar to this down the road. Another example is the upcoming Woonsocket primary. If this statute were to be in effect for the presidential preference primary, which we know it is because it's going to happen too soon, we're having a special election in March in Woonsocket. And if this statute were in effect, we would actually have to open the drop box for the presidential preference primary before the actual before the actual election day for the special election. So essentially, when the special election in Woonsocket happens, we would not be able to lock that box for that special election for city council because the law says we have to keep it open for the presidential preference primary. And this is just another example of how these two sections of the law actually conflict. So we've come up with several solutions to address this problem, which would be a decision by the board in terms of adequately solving it. The first potential solution is to remove the requirement that the drop boxes be locked at 8 p.m. on election night and allow the local board to sign and insert an affidavit attesting that ballots were removed at 8 p.m. on election night. Because at that point, they don't need to lock the box. If they don't need to lock the box, they attest that they removed all the ballots at 8 o'clock for that special election that they're conducting. However, the box would still remain open to collect ballots for the upcoming statewide election, which would be held within those 35 days from that date. The second solution is to continue to require that the drop box be locked at 8 o'clock on election night for these special elections. But if it would require that it be reopened the next morning if there were a statewide election scheduled for the following month that is subject to that 35-day drop box requirement. So for example, They would go out for the special election, lock the drop box at 8 PM, and the next morning, they would reopen it to continue to receive ballots for the upcoming statewide election. Third, the legislation could be changed to prohibit the scheduling of special elections in the month preceding any statewide election. So that would mean that most August of an even year, in August and October of an even year, you would not be able to schedule a special election so that it would not conflict with the time frame for the drop boxes for those big elections. And then finally, another option is to reduce that 35 days that's currently in there to something that does not conflict or has a less likelihood of conflicting, or to continue with the current 20-day drop box requirement that is in the statute right now. If we reduced it to, for example, 32 days, 35 days will end up being the Tuesday that we know. If we reduce it to 32 days, that would mean it would be on a Friday. So the special election would happen on a Tuesday, and they would lock at 8 o'clock, and then on Friday of that same week, they would need to open the drop box for the upcoming statewide election, whether it's the primary or the general election. And that would allow for the drop box to be open longer than the current 20 days, but less likelihood that it would potentially conflict with the upcoming statewide election. So those are our alternatives to solving this potential conflict, which we understand is rare, but it is expected to occur in those certain months where we do expect the 35-day requirement to overlap with the requirements of special elections. I'm happy to answer any questions or.
Question, really an observation. I think another option, which would be compatible with one of yours, is to use different colored mail envelopes. So you'll be able to distinguish the voters for a special election from those voters with the PPP or the general election. That way it would make it easier at the deadline, when you lock the box, to pull out the designated color of the mail ballot. What do you think about that?
I know that we do use different color based on category, so that would be a question we would have for the Secretary of State's office. So for example, we try to have category military and overseas color coded a different color. So I certainly know it's possible to have different colors. That I would need to discuss with them if that's still something that is on the table, that we still have the ability to have those different colors going forward.
I know this particular topic was subject of some heated discussion up in the General Assembly. I don't think I ever made it anywhere, but I know there you have those four options. Would it be better if you held this for a while, let the staff come up with 2 or 3 different solutions for presentation to the board? Would that be more helpful?
Well, we certainly could use more time to develop a solution as like the suggestion that you just made. We'd have to give some thought to the processing of that and to determine if it would ensure that ballots are not in fact counted, after the 8 p.m. deadline. So that would allow us more opportunity to analyze the various scenarios here to solve this issue.
Right. So.
I might suggest, if we are still impaneling the legislative subcommittee, to maybe continue this a month. Either some more staff input or to send it over to the subcommittee at some point. I don't know what the board's feeling is on that as to whether we're even going to have a subcommittee, but I think it's a standing committee, so it could certainly be referred over.
Well, I think at this point, we should refer it back to the staff for them to come up with the different solutions and present it at a later time. That way it'll give some more thought, then it can be referred to the subcommittee for their action and then presented to the full board. I think we have more than enough time
That a
to do
motion?
this. Yeah, I'll make that motion.
Is there a second? To send it to the staff, or any other comments as to how you think we should handle it?
I'll second, but I have an item under discussion. It looks like what we have in front of us is not actually one of these particular solutions. It's a fifth solution here, which is, well, I guess I have a couple questions. One was whether the legislative committee had looked at it, which clearly they have not, or maybe not this year, maybe last year. I'm just interested in section B. It indicates the last sentence, drop boxes shall be monitored by video surveillance systems. In practice, do you know how that's been carried out, Miguel? Because I can't imagine someone sitting there 24 hours a day looking at, 40 cameras, 40 video feeds, but do you know how that's been carried out in practice?
So that requirement was originally part of the board's regulations, and the board's regulation was essentially carried over almost verbatim into state law. And that requirement, we did impose on the local boards. We did provide them with cameras, and we do provide them with support in many instances. Some of them use municipal cameras, but some of them do use our cameras. And we require that they retain that footage of that 20-day period for 90 days. So, and that was a recent change after 2020. During 2022, we extended it it was 30 days previously, but now it is 90 days. And they do only need to retain that 20-day footage for that amount of time. But yes, it is something that we do remind them of before an upcoming election to check the status of their cameras. And if they do have any technical issues for ones that we provide through a vendor, then we will send out a technician and do a service call for them.
So it sounds like no one's looking at them unless there is an issue. I think in Cranston, there was an issue at some point
Correct.
with one of
Yes.
the boxes, and the Cranston police went back and looked at the footage, so no one's really monitoring it constantly. It's obviously I guess that would be a concern of mine. I would just want to make sure that if we are entertaining the idea of extending the period, it just, to me, extends the period where something could go wrong. In terms of obviously another 15 days, it's a pretty significant amount of time, almost doubling it. So that would be a concern. Have we considered ever putting in the legislation itself, or recommended, like actually saying that it must be kept for 90 days post-election? Is that something the staff has entertained?
That's in our regulation.
Just in the regulation?
It is in our regulation for the 90 days.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
So there is a,
Mr. Chairman?
sorry. go.
Do I have to do? No, I have a question, and I'm also sorry that I am late.
No, not at all.
We do have a legislative subcommittee, right?
I believe it's still a standing committee.
Yeah, I believe so too. Do you know, Bob might know better,
I
or
didn't
Miguel?
attend those, Madam Chair, so I don't know if they took a vote in some way
Okay.
to terminate the committee, but I wouldn't think they would have. I would
Maybe
think
we
that it
can
is standing.
Go back and look at the minutes. I thought we restarted it.
That would be
and
my
I thought-
assumption.
2 or 3 meetings ago, we did
Right.
indicate there were 4 members of the board that were on that.
And I thought that Vice Chairman Deason, when we had talked about meeting on a more frequent basis
Correct.
to hear, so we can check that, but I think,
In all likelihood,
That's
it's
a good-
still standing, and I would assume it would remain so that during the legislative session, it can quickly address anything that might come up.
So there is a motion and a second to refer this back to the staff with some of the suggestions from Commissioner Scholes and Commissioner Jack Foney. If there's no other discussion, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
hi.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. And now I will turn the meeting on item number, one other question, Ray. I know we sort of bifurcated number 2. Is that still acceptable with regard to the Open Meetings Act? Because we did sort of bifurcate item number 2. They were both pieces of legislation. They were 2 separate pieces that were provided.
Yeah, they were
We voted on this.
attached. They were referenced in the attachment, so that's fine that we took a vote on both.
So I will turn it back over to the chair, and we are on item number 3.
Item number 3, thank you. Item number 3, the board may discuss and vote to support the legislation to be presented to the General Assembly by the Rhode Island Towns and Cities Clerk Associations as set forth in the attached legislative summary. And I think we're starting with you, Nick? Oh, okay. All right.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. Nick Lima, Registrar Director of Elections for the City of Cranston Canvassing Authority, along with Mike Narducci, who's Administrator of Elections for the City of Providence Board of Canvassers. Mike is the Vice Chair, and I am the Chair of the Elections Committee of the Rhode Island City and Town Clerks Association Elections Committee. And I'm here in my capacity as the lobbyist for the association, as well as for the City of Cranston Board of Canvassers regarding these bills. Madam Chair, would you like me to go through all 4 bills at once or take one at a time?
What's the board's preference? One at a time? Is that? Okay.
So
Thank you.
the first bill in the packet, an act relating to elections, registration of voters, section 17-9.1.3. This is very similar to a bill that was actually introduced and voted upon by the General Assembly last year. It passed both chambers, but in slightly different forms. And it relates to newspaper ads and what our advertising requirements are. Over the last several years, the local clerks have made it an objective to modernize some of the ways that we reach out to voters, and that has included making adjustments to requirements for newspaper ads. In some cases, we've actually added ads and changed them around or made them a website ad. For example, we have our warrant posting, which used to be a requirement to post a physical warrant in every precinct, which could be 30 or even 80 precincts. And we changed that to allow local boards to instead do one newspaper ad. In this case, we have the voter registration deadline. Now, in the last 7 years that I've worked in Cranston, we've had numerous voter registration deadlines. We haven't had any voters come into our office because they saw a newspaper ad about the deadline on the deadline day. Now, the current statute only requires the newspaper ad to be run if the board will have non-standard hours on the deadline day, which is always going to be a Sunday, 30 days prior to a Tuesday election. If the board is going to open its regular business hours on that Sunday, then actually there is no advertising deadline at all, or advertising requirement at all. So it only requires for non-standard hours. Now, most boards obviously are not opening a full 8 hours on that Sunday. There's a lot of overtime and expense involved in doing so. And in most cases, I think in almost nearly every city and town, actually getting individuals to come in on that Sunday and drop off a voter registration, we might see one. Most towns receive 0. So it's not a great use of our resources. Many towns will put a drop box at a police station, or they have a 24-hour slot at City or Town Hall. They'll utilize that. We would like to in the future actually use the board elections drop boxes for this process, but that would require the 35 days for the drop boxes to be open. So in some cases, including Cranston, we do go in, and the minimum hours required are to be open between 1 and 4 p.m. on the deadline day. We have a shift minimum in Cranston, so we open for 4 hours between 12 o'clock and 4 o'clock p.m. We advertise that twice in a newspaper and local circulation. We have 4 elections in 2024. That is several $1,000s in newspaper ads that we're going to be advertising for what amounts to very little, if not any effect, because we do not expect voters to actually come in on that Sunday or see those ads. We have online voter registration now, vote.ri.gov. Anyone can go with driver's license or state ID and register to vote online. That did not exist when this requirement was first implemented in state law. We're not looking to get rid of the requirement. We just want to, in lieu of a newspaper ad, allow us to instead post it for a consecutive number of days leading up to the deadline on the municipality's website, and actually in getting some feedback last year from the ACLU in a conspicuous and prominent fashion, which is included in the language in this. Now, as I mentioned, this did pass the General Assembly in both chambers last year, but in slightly different versions. And that's because there were some objections from the newspapers around the state, especially the local papers. They were concerned about ad revenue. And we discussed that with the bill sponsors, and we actually agreed to a compromise. We'll get rid of this newspaper ad, which we don't think is that effective. And we'll replace it with a new newspaper ad for early voting, which we think is a better use of our resources, because currently there is no advertising requirement for early voting. And that was agreed to, and that actually is the version of the bill that passed the House. The Senate version remained unamended, and that's why they were different. There is another newspaper ad requirement that is covered in this, and that is for local ballot questions, publication of questions for voters. And similarly, we'd like to make that just a web-only or municipal website advertising requirement. In totality, what this bill's, the objective of the bill, what it intends to do is to remove 3 newspaper ads, add 2 newspaper ads. It's a net positive for the local clerks. We are spending our resources in a wiser fashion. And we think that will be helpful for elections administration and put the resources where they should be going, which is towards our early voting operation and towards other operations.
Thank you, Mr. Lima. Mr. Narducci, anything to add? Okay. Given we're going to take these one at a time, do board members have questions, comments at this time? Commissioner Jeff Rhode.
Mr. Lima, just a question. Mr. Brown from the ACLU submitted his comments, and I don't think he's here today. But related to this, his concern is that some households don't have broadband access. I don't believe, I guess my question for him would be, does this cover like mobile phones as well? Because I'm sure broadband access is different from, because someone could still have access to the internet through their phone. So that notwithstanding, have you thought about that? And what does the city and towns association have in response to that?
So it would be correct in that you can access vote.ri.gov on a mobile phone. You don't need to have an actual physical computer or a hardwired internet connection. There are multiple other ways. And you can also call our office and we can mail voters registration forms. I mean, I'll be honest with you, if it's not near the deadline and somebody really needs it, I would personally drive it to the house and drop it off if I had to. I'm sure many other of my colleagues would do the same. But the Rhode Island Town City Clerks Association did vote unanimously last year to support this bill. And our association is having our next quarterly meeting on this Friday, and I expect to have unanimous support from the local boards once again.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I'd just like to point out the decline of newspapers has caused some serious problems for local boards of canvass and advertising. So I sympathize with you on this. But the question is, how do you get the message out to everyone else? That's the big issue.
And I think by making it a requirement to put it on the website, which is not a current requirement for either of these ads. And it also requires the early voting also to be published on the website too, which is not in the current statute either. I think that actually helps to mitigate some of that issue where we've seen the massive declines in readership and circulation and availability of newspapers. There was a time not very long ago where newspapers were in every household, and now they're in a vanishingly small number of households compared to just a decade or two ago.
Okay, I might make a suggestion if I will. I know we just received, we just received today, the comments from the ACLU. Personally, I would like to be able to absorb and understand those better before taking a vote to support or what have you. I don't know if we would do something similar here, if someone would want to make a motion to refer to the Ledge Subcommittee after further review.
I would certainly make that motion, Madam Chair. To refer it over to the subcommittee and just hold on support at this point. I do believe that we could focus on the modification to 17.8.10, because I think in reading the ACLU's letter, they talk about the other 2 areas as being somewhat niche areas, if you will. And so with regard to the amendment to 17.9.13, I think that there's not an objection as long as the website posting is conspicuous and prominent. And I think with regard to 17.8.11, they're looking for various media. So I think it's really just those 2 sections, 8.10 and 8.11 that they have a problem with. So I wouldn't have a problem sending that over to the subcommittee if the board so chooses. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying I'll make that motion.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? No second.
Okay.
Okay, do we have another motion?
I'll make a motion to support the legislation for this first piece of legislation, I guess, for section 17-9.1-3 that we have before us as recommended by the Rhode Island Towns and Cities Clerks Association.
I'll second that.
Sorry. Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Commissioner Connors?
Another question for Nick. Not that I think it's ripe for change in legislation, but with the rise in use of social media, has there been any discussion at the local towns and city level in using social media to put this information out?
We have, and many towns do voluntarily put election information on social media. The issue is not every town has social media. Even the larger towns, City of Cranston, for example, we have only a Facebook page that's maintained by the mayor's office. We don't have active social media on any other accounts, and many of the smaller towns might be in a similar position. So there aren't currently, that I'm aware of, any other statutes and state law that require social media postings for legal deadlines such as this. And there may be some requirements for other things like city planning and things, but that I'm not aware of or familiar with. But to add it is something we discussed internally, but because it just those platforms don't exist universally across all 39 cities and towns, it would be an added burden because it would then require someone to manage and create all those accounts.
Thank you.
I have one question. Yes. Nick, on page 2, the new wording says the local board may substitute advertising by posting it on the website. Okay, I'm sure you discussed it with your staff, members of your association. So perhaps you can share with the board under what circumstances the local boards may substitute the web advertising for that of newspaper advertising.
Absolutely, Commissioner. So the other statutes that we have amended in the last couple of years have used similar may language, and that is to allow the local boards the option, if they still feel that it is in their particular municipality, that you might have a local newspaper that's read by a larger percentage of the population in for example, in a different town, the local board retains that ability to satisfy the statutory requirement by still running the newspaper ad.
Just to follow up, so the local board may do both, correct?
Absolutely.
They're not prohibited from
Correct.
doing one over the other, right?
It's not eliminating the ad, it's just giving the board an option based on their needs and resources.
Understood. Anything else? We have a motion and a second, and some discussion has been had. If there's nothing further, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. Want to move on?
So the next bill is 1711-1, Division of Towns and Representative Districts into voting districts. Like the newspaper ad bill, this bill has actually already been introduced in the General Assembly. And I should have mentioned that for the newspaper ad bill, it's House Bill 7222. This bill is House 7248. Both bills are sponsored on the House side by Representative Jackie Baginski. And we expect them to be introduced on the Senate side by Senator Frank Lombardi. This bill is being introduced now for a third year. We've made some modifications to it based on feedback from the General Assembly, but in both 2022 and 2023, this precinct cap legislation in a substantially similar form did pass unanimously the House of Representatives twice, but has not yet had a vote in the Senate. So in speaking with various senators and also members of the House, last year, as you may recall, the Board of Elections voted to support both this bill and our bill regarding active and inactive voters. And rather than having two separate bills, we decided to combine it. And I did note the ACLU had some comments about that. Our idea in combining it is it does give the legislature options if during committee testimony and discussion later on in the session, they would like to sub-A the bill or strike certain language or give us one or the other. The options are there in the legislation as introduced. We as a clerks association, and I think I can speak for all the clerks, would certainly like to see both if possible. And the reason for that is, and this is what the ACLU's testimony, written testimony does not really get into, is that from our data, elections turnout data, more than 99% of inactive voters do not vote. I'm trying to remember the exact number. I think it was 99.4% or something to that effect. So if you think about that, if you have a precinct that has 100 inactive voters out of the, say, 2,000 registered voters in the precinct, and you're anticipating a 50% turnout, that is 1/2 of one inactive voter that you're expecting to vote on election day. So that really does not affect turnout in the way that the ACLU's testimony illustrates. It is a very small portion of this bill. I don't think it's the most important thing to focus on. The most important part is the increase in the cap. And we have supplied extensive data over the last 2 years in support of this legislation that would support an increase in that cap. It's an arbitrarily low number. And the danger is, especially as we head into a presidential election year and voter registrations increase, we have some existing polling locations, including a couple in my municipality in Cranston, that are nearing that hard cap, that not substantially more than 3,000 voters, which is 3,500. And if those polls before November exceed that number, they'll have to be split in two. And we'll have to take existing voters that are going to a perfectly fine polling location that isn't handling 3,500, it's really with a 50% turnout, some doing early voting, it's handling 1,900 voters, 800 voters, and send them to an inferior, further away, less ideal location. We're already using the best polls that we have available. And the idea of this bill, and what's new here, is this section C, establish polling places unaffected, which sets out that provision that once we establish polling place, either during as a default poll, which is established in the decennial redistricting process every 10 years, and it's expected to be used for the next 10 years unless modified, or once we have polls approved for a particular election, like the general election, we already have combination statutes for primaries and special elections. Once the poll is established for general election, even if it slightly goes over that cap, there is no need to split it up, because that is obviously not ideal in the interest of the voters. It's not ideal in the interest of election administrators. So again, this is language that we've added to the bill this year in reflection of some of the feedback we received the last 2 sessions. And if the General Assembly still has hesitation, for example, in increasing the cap, well, they can perhaps maintain just the active voters component in this section C, which would at least provide us some support as we head into this busy election cycle, and reduce that fear that we'll have to split an existing poll and add resources, add voting equipment, add poll workers to another poll for really no good reason other than that the law says so.
Yes.
Just a question for council. Ray, with regard to the designation of active eligible voters, active eligible registered voters, in that section of the statute, because we don't have the whole thing in front of us, but if you could just refresh my recollection, is the term active eligible registered voter defined sufficiently?
I'd have to look myself. I can't remember whether it is or not.
Because that would be my only question, that we're carving out someone. So if you could maybe help us with that.
Yeah, I could look at that. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I'd be happy to look at that for the next meeting. One thought I had, if I could just add one thing on this whole discussion about newspapers. Nick, is there any distinction drawn between like a blog of a newspaper versus the actual newspaper that is circulated within a locality? So if Newport News had a website, first, do you think that the cost for advertising locally would be a lot less? And do you think that the voter might have more access to the electric version of the paper as opposed to the dwindling paper version?
So I'm not aware of any definitions in the statute that define what a newspaper in local circulation is.
Yeah,
Could
I
it be
understand
broadly interpreted to include the online component of newspapers? I think certainly. In fact, in Cranston, when we advertise in the Cranston Herald, as part of our cost incurred for advertising, they put the ad on their website as well. So that's a freebie that may vary from paper to paper. But I was in the media industry and worked in newspapers myself prior to being an election official. And I do know that because a lot of newspapers, even local papers, are now behind paywalls, it is a little more difficult now to access them than maybe it was a few years ago. when it comes to their advertising, what's available online.
Is there an option to only advertise in the digital copy?
It depends on the paper. I think the Providence Journal might have more options than, for example, the Herald or Warwick Beacon.
Any, Commissioner Jackson?
Sorry, just a quick, in my time on the Cranston Board of Canvassers, I can tell you I've had experience with this, and the staff in the office was required to open up another polling place because the cap was just set frankly too low. Mr. Lima can correct me, but I believe we voted to support this to move it when I was on the Board of Canvassers as well. And I can tell you that the polling places that we opened were very slow. So while I appreciate we don't want long lines, two things that have happened, one thing that has happened in the last several years is very much increased the throughput of voters through the voting places, the poll pads. It's made a gigantic difference. I can see, remember some of the locations like Scottish Rite and Cranston that there were lines out the door for like M to T, but the next election, there was minimal lines. You waited maybe 5-10 minutes. So I would wholeheartedly support this, although I think it sounds like we're going to refer it to some more investigation. But I can just tell you, it caused extra work, time, effort. Getting polling workers was excessive in my opinion. So I would support this when it comes back up.
Any other questions, comments?
I just have one
Commissioner
question,
Schultz?
Nick. In your chair of the subcommittee, of your committee, I'm sure you discussed this with other boards of canvassers. But are you aware of any voting districts, precincts that have been so overwhelmed that it needed to open up a second voting precinct?
In terms of the actual turnout on election
Actual
day?
turnout, that you say, well, there's too many people showing up and we got to open up a second one.
Yeah, in looking over the past couple of years, and the board election staff and Secretary of State would know better than I would, but I just know in talking to anecdotally with my other election directors and registrars and clerks around the state, I'm not aware of any towns that said, well, no, this poll has too many people at it, because that really just isn't a problem. Even with a 60% turnout, you have a poll that might have 3,000 assigned voters, and you're going to get 12 or 1,500 on election day. Well, we staff those polls accordingly. We give them an extra pair of supervisors to check in voters. We give them an extra DS200. We give them extra privacy booths. There's studies the Board of Elections has done, in partnership with URI on line queuing. We've done so many things to mitigate those things over the years. It's just not really a problem like it may have been in the past. And the poll pads obviously are a huge part of that, because we can check in a voter in many cases within 45 seconds. And that was not the case with the old paper books and paper ballot applications. But also to answer Commissioner DeSpone's question.
I was going to ask you before we did anything.
I'm not sure which statute in particular defines active, inactive, pending, or active with NCOA change voters, but I do know that there is another statute that defines how voting equipment is to be allocated per polling place. And that statute allocates voting equipment such as privacy booths from the Board of Elections to the precincts based on active voters. So it actually mirrors some language that is already in the general laws.
Commissioner Connors?
I'd like to just echo the sentiments of Commissioner Jack Loney. From my work in Cumberland on the local board of canvassers, I've seen this issue the same, and the difficulty in finding poll workers sometimes adds to this. So I would also be supporting this proposal.
Does someone wish to make a motion?
Well, absent any other motion, I'll make a motion to support. Sorry, let me look at the number here.
Madam Chair, I have no problem seconding the motion to support. I would just caution that on the, and ask council maybe for some comments on the active voter. And there's something that even if you put this before the legislature, the understanding would be that, I think it'd be a benefit to make sure that's defined. That's
I'd be happy to have that answer to you by your next meeting.
That's fine.
We can postpone that. I'm happy to get that answer too.
So I
If you
mean,
want to postpone
we
it,
could
so.
put it out for our next meeting.
So I'll withdraw any motion that I was making.
That would be my only concern, but otherwise I would support this as well. I sat on the board in Lincoln for a number of years and we had very much these same issues.
So what will the motion be then? Do you
I
want?
would move to continue it to our next agenda,
Second.
unless you think it's gonna take longer than that, right? If it-
No, not at all.
Okay,
This will
then
not take
We'll
long.
just move it to our next agenda if that's acceptable to everybody.
Okay, moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
I am an aye as well. Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes.
2 down, 2 to go. So the next one is the write-in legislation, 17-1931 irregular ballots is on the first page of it. So this has already been introduced on the House side. It's H7223 from Representative Bakinski. The Clerks Association has reached out to Senator Lou DePalma on the Senate side, who's agreed to introduce it there. Now, this is a bill that in the past was a Board of Elections bill, but it does help the Board of Elections, particularly the staff, post-election in tabulating write-ins and precinct count books, but also gives extraordinary help to the local boards of canvassers. And with the former local board members up there, I'm sure you're familiar with this process. We spend an inordinate amount of time post-election tabulating write-ins that are not eligible to hold office. In some cases, a vulgar, frivolous, and it's just not a great use of our resources. Now, this bill is introduced by the Board of Elections in the past, I believe has now passed the House 3 separate times in the last 4 years. It has not yet passed the Senate. The local boards are going to put a lot of time into advocating for this bill this session, and then the local clerks. And the reason is, post-election, we have our hands full. After Election Day, we are adjudicating provisional ballots, which can be dozens to hundreds, depending on the town. We have to get our poll workers payroll process and make sure that we account for that. We have to get our equipment accounted for and make sure the Board of Elections gets all their voting equipment back from all of our precinct polls. We have to get our manual count ballots, our election returns, all of our documentation together and return to the State Board of Elections. We have to begin catching up on the voter registration backlog. We weren't allowed to process voters for weeks. We have the potential, in all the case happens, with recounts. And of course, we also have the risk limiting audit. All of those processes are far more important than tabulating Daffy Duck and Tom Brady. It is not really our function to have opinion polls. It is interesting for sure. I agree with that. I read Kathy Gregg's article every year about write-ins after a major election. And I do understand the opinion that the ACLU has taken in multiple years now, whenever this bill comes up. However, I just strongly disagree because we have finite resources and we have to put our resources where it makes sense. And we cannot have 39 local boards of canvassers collectively spending hundreds and hundreds of hours, multiple days post-election, hand tabulating votes for offices that cannot possibly hold the office. Even if in a council race, Donald Duck gets more votes than someone who's actually on the ballot, under no circumstances will Donald Duck be certified as the winner, and under no circumstances will Donald Duck be sworn in because he's a fictional character and doesn't exist. And there was some confusion in the General Assembly, I think even last year about this, which is why the local boards and the local clerks are going to spend a lot of time advocating about this bill this session, because there's a difference between counting a vote and tabulating a vote. Every vote does count. If you were on a write-in, Teddy Roosevelt for president, you certainly can do that. And that vote will count. It will be reflected in the results as a write-in vote on the State Board of Elections website. That information can be publicized by the Board of Elections for academic research. Those write-ins are all captured and on what I like to call CBS receipts, those long tabulation sheets from the DS200s. But at the end of the day, it really shouldn't be our role to sit down and tabulate them unless it actually impacts the result. And this bill takes all those things into consideration. What happens if there are no candidates qualified and declared? Well, by default, all the write-ins in that particular race would be tabulated. What happens if there are more write-in votes cast in a race, even if no one declares a write-in? Well, by default, if there are more write-ins, enough write-in votes cast to potentially affect the outcome, we would still tabulate those results. Or what happens if a candidate drops out? Well, in this version of the bill, which is, again, given feedback that we had from last year, it's been adjusted a bit. Write-in candidates would actually have until the day of the election at 4:00 p.m. to declare their candidacy, which that's in various versions of the bill, that deadline has moved around a bit. Didn't really see an issue with it being 4:00 on the day of an election. That is, if a candidate passes away, there's a big controversy the weekend before the election, you're right up until that Tuesday at 4 to declare your write-in candidacy. And if a write-in declares, then no matter how many votes they get, we will tabulate the results and publicize those. So it saves the local boards of canvassers an enormous amount of time. But on the flip side, it's also critically important because Rhode Island is essentially the only state in the country that I am aware of that, one, allows write-ins, and two, does not require write-ins to declare, and three, still has to tabulate all those write-ins. There's about a dozen states that do not require write-ins to declare, Rhode Island being one of them. The vast majority of states actually do require a declaration from write-ins, and that's makes sense because we want to know who the candidates are. We want to make sure that they're eligible. We want to make sure that the campaign finance division can reach out to that candidate, contact them, and get them reporting, because regardless of whether or not they're write-in or not, they are still bound by the campaign finance laws. And we can't do any of those things unless we get a piece of paper from them attesting who they are, that they live where they say they do. And I think it's in the public's interest to know who candidates are who are on the ballot, who may actually get enough votes to hold the office. So this is a bill that solves all those problems. And on behalf of the locals, I think this is one of our most important bills, and we really hope that you'll support it, because otherwise in November 2024, we'll be spending days once again tabulating frivolous write-ins that do not actually affect the outcome or serve a greater public interest.
Thank you, Mr. Lima. Yes, I've been, I remember hearing testimony for a long time on these bills last session. Does the board have any questions, comments for Mr. Lima? Go ahead.
Just off the top of your head, if you know, you mentioned that some states do require write-in candidates to declare. Do you know off the top of your head, not to put you on the spot, but do they allow them to declare up until 4:00 on election day, or is there some other time frame?
It varies state to state. In some cases, it can be weeks ahead of election day. In some cases, it could be the day of. I'd have to look it up. The EAC, Federal Election Assistance Commission, has a report that actually compares all the states. I think that data might be in there. I can check that.
Commissioner Schultz.
I think it could be helpful if we know the number of write-ins in each of the cities and towns, let's say over the past two election cycles. So it gives an idea, say in Cranston and in Providence, what the number is.
Mike, do you know off the top of your head? I know in Cranston there's thousands.
Okay.
This is my first one for Providence, but I know when I was in Woonsocket, we had over, I think, 300.
And that covers every race, right? From city council right up to the president. So not just confined to one office. Is that right?
It's most common in races that are unopposed. We see a lot for president, but in General Assembly races, for example, if a General Assembly member is running unopposed, which happens an awful lot, we'll see in many cases just for that race, 700, 800, or even 1,000 write-in votes.
So just from your review of all this, the people who write in, we're talking about a real person versus a fictional person. Those people who are a qualified elector in the city or district, how many qualified electors would be written in versus everyone else?
Anecdotally,
Yeah.
it depends on the particular race. It depends on the circumstances. Like in a General Assembly race, it could be 50-50, 60-40. I can't really give you a good number, but it's Cookie Monster, and then it might be somebody's cousin, and then the next one could be an actual qualified elector who could
Right.
potentially serve, but has not declared or indicated that they're willing to serve. And then the next one could be Big Bird.
So the local boards do not classify those or categorize them by whether or not they're a fictional person, a real person, or whatever.
Correct, and nor would we be able to, because we have, for example, many people that share the same name, and there's no way for us to know without a declaration whether or not John Smith, there could be 15 John Smiths in Cranston, and we don't know who to attribute that to. So it's all just reported out in one report.
It surely imposes a tremendous burden on all the boards. Okay, thanks.
Does the board have a motion?
I'll move to support this legislation. I used to have to count those votes.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Motion carries to support the legislation.
And the last bill, and then probably the least priority bill for us, but it's still a local clerk's bill, is this flashing light bill 312431, that would allow local election officials as designated by the Board of Canvassers to apply through the DMV for a flashing light permit for their vehicle. This is a safety issue. As an election official, I have a lot of roles out on the roadways. I can tell you that, just, I'm gonna use Cranston a lot as an example. I probably spend 800 to 1,000 miles out on the road every election period. That's putting up vote here signs, 88 cones at all of our polling places, picking up those signs the night of the election, sometimes driving around those dark roads in Western Cranston around midnight. There have been multiple times where I've actually almost been struck by vehicles while performing those duties. We're also required to escort the delivery trucks from the State Board of Elections from pole to pole. So on a few days before an election, I'll be again driving around. We pull up on the side of the road and we're dropping off equipment. There was an incident a few years ago where I actually had to block traffic using my vehicle because of a DS200 that had fallen in the road. Yeah, there were multiple other examples I could use where we escort ballots and delivering to homes. This is amber flashing lights. These are not emergency lights. This would be similar to what is already allowed in the statute for postal carriers, mail delivery and other delivery vehicles, tow trucks, people that own a pickup truck with a snowplow, news media, journalists are allowed to apply for the same permit. And it just would just extend it to election officials who have primary responsibility for the oversight of polling locations as designated by the local board. And that's because in most cases around the state, and maybe some of the small towns, they may have a motor pool, they may have a town vehicle that already has safety lights on it. That is not the case in every community, including Cranston. We have a small budget, a small department, and there's a limited motor pool of vehicles available, so we use our personal vehicle. And I did speak last session when this bill was introduced for the first time to Administrator Craddock to ask if the DMV had any concerns. The only things that Administrator Craddock brought up were whether or not the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns had any issue with the legislation. And I spoke with the league last session, and they did not. And he also brought up the Rhode Island Interlocal Trust regarding liability. And when the trust responded to my inquiries, I shared the bill with them. They actually said that this would help reduce liability for the cities and towns because election officials were one of the few public officials who have a duty and out on the roadways, stopping and going in traffic, sometimes hundreds of times, but don't have the ability to apply for a permit to make them more visible to traffic.
Thank you, Mr. Lima. And I said, what is so this was introduced last session. Was there, given everything you just said about the support and the checks and balances you went through, what was the opposition, if you remember?
I'm not aware of any opposition. It
Okay.
just simply
It just
come out
didn't
for a
make it.
vote.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions or comments from board members? Hearing none, does someone wish to make a motion?
I'll make a motion to support what's listed here as 2023 H5387.
Oh, second.
And this bill has been introduced in the Senate, so it's now S2094.
Thank
Include
you.
that as well.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Motion passes to approve the legislation. Thank you, Mr. Lima
Thank you.
and Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Narducci.
Thank you, members of the board.
Madam Chair, so the record is complete. I suggest that there be a motion to introduce the letter of the ACLU dated January 23 into the record.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded to introduce the letter from the ACU into the record. Any further comments? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Agenda item number 4, the board may vote to meet in executive session pursuant to Rhode Island General Laws 42-46-5 subsection A subsection 1 to discuss qualifications and credentials for candidates for the position of executive director. Do we have a motion?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. We will move into executive session at 3:19 PM. Hey, Patty, you're here, yep. This meeting of the Board of Elections will now conclude. Do we have a motion to seal the minutes of executive session?
So moved.
Moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. Is that all I have to do, right? So now I can move to 5, or,
I believe it's number 5?
okay.
Yes.
No, I just know, I don't, okay. It's learning curve.
Yep, number 5.
Item number 5, the board may discuss and vote to select candidates for the position of executive director to be invited for a second interview before the full board.
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion to invite candidates by number 10 and number 30 for a second in-person interview with the full board.
Motion, do we have a second? Second. Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? It is unanimous. The motion passes. And I think that's it. No further business. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Moved and
Second.
seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And the motion passes. We are adjourned at 3:59 PM. I haven't